Mirna Tatul. I am the research associate with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. I want to start by acknowledging that we are located in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Treaty 7 includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So today we are going to screen one of two of our Truth and Reconciliation videos. The video is entitled Understanding Truth and Reconciliation. It looks at truth and reconciliation from the angles of history and legal framework, including human rights and actions that still need to be taken. The screening will be followed by discussion, and the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions. Now I will let my colleague Pamela Dos Ramos introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Mirna. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce my friend, Cheryle Chagnon-Greyeyes. Cheryle is a proud Nehiyaw Esquaw Cree woman, a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation from Saskatchewan. So that's also Treaty 6 and Métis. Her ceremonially gifted Cree name translates to Healing Woman Who Walks Far. And Cheryle has resided in Calgary, Treaty 7 region, Alberta, since 1993. Cheryle earned a BA in Communication and a BA in Canadian Native Studies from the University of Calgary. And she also earned a diploma in Advertising and Public Relations from Grant MacEwan University, which is in Edmonton, as you will know. Cheryle received the rank of corporal in the Canadian Air Force, receiving an honorable discharge after 5 years of service. She has been an Indigenous activist within Calgary and area for the past 2 decades, speaking, marching, singing, and drumming for women, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirited, Sisters in Spirit, Justice for Jackie Crazy Bull, Indigenous justice, championing the environment and equality, and speaking up for those who cannot speak. Cheryle retired as an administrative coordinator at the Native Center of the University of Calgary. She was also former leader of the Green Party of Alberta in 2018-2019, and a Kairos blanket exercise facilitator 2017 to 2020. Cheryle received an Institute for the Advancement of Aboriginal Women Esquire Award for Justice and Human Rights in May 2023. Congrats, Cheryle. And recognized as a traditional knowledge keeper, Cree elder, and pipe carrier, Cheryle provides service sharing Indigenous protocol, territorial acknowledgements, medicine wheel teachings, Cree, I've lost my place, Indigenous cultural teachings, stories, prayers, and ceremony, on request, of course. Cheryle is a member of the Storytellers of Canada and Storytelling Alberta as an Indigenous storyteller and performer. She's the mother of 2 and a kokum, or grandmother, to 5 beautiful grandchildren. I give you Cheryle.
Thank you so much, Pamela. That was really beautiful. I appreciate. And you did a great job on the pronunciations. Thank you. Yes, my Cree name is Nananthawe Esquayo Yahuka Pimotate, which means healing woman who walks far. Aren't you glad I didn't make you say that?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Today, we're here to honor Diversity Week, but also that March 21st is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center puts that front and foremost for the work that they do. I'm very grateful to have been associated with them for many years, working on the March 21st events that we held on campus. And I'm very grateful to be able to have worked on behalf of Indigenous racism and prejudice and working against that in our communities. I'm very blessed that I've been able to work with Neil Scott in developing this video. It's fantastic, by the way, Neil. You did an awesome job. And I'm grateful to our speakers who are in it. Tammy, you did a wonderful job. I just appreciate the legal aspect of looking at the history of Indigenous, how we got into this predicament in Canada here. I'm also grateful to Dr. Barb Barnes, who teaches at both Mount Royal and the University of Calgary, and who's written books on Indigenous history and social sciences focused on Indigenous issues. I'm very grateful, very humbled, and very honored to be able to share this beautiful video today. And know that for me, it was a project that developed working with Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre, along with Teresa Miles, who is a graduate student from Workland, and Rowan Hickey, who was an articling student with Alberta Civil Liberties. And we developed a full-day workshop. This is what we're showing today, is just providing a little overview of the original history. The day-long workshop, I can go into more detail after the fact, but I just want to say thank you to Alberta Civil Liberties, to Pamela and Linda, and for the work that went into developing the workshop, and especially for the work that went into developing these fantastic videos, which I'm always amazed at how Neil can get so much information in such a short period of time. It's a miracle. You're a miracle worker. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming today to be able to share this information in a good way, and to appreciate this video and how it looks at the different aspects of the Indigenous experience right here in Canada on our lands. My focus is very much about eliminating Indigenous discrimination and racial injustice. And as you'll see in the video, it permeates our society. It's systemic and it's endemic. And we need to take personal responsibility to follow those 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as Canadian citizens and as responsible members of our community. I'm very grateful and very humbled to have been associated with this. And I'm very pleased to be able to share this incredible video with each and every one of you today. Thank you very much, Sharanjeet and Myrna, for making this happen today. I'm grateful. And I'll now hand it off to Myrna. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. So I'll play the video right now.
Life was tremendous before the European people arrived. There was a lot of decision-making, there was a lot of cooperation, there was a lot of rituals, there was a lot of ceremonies, there was togetherness.
Indigenous peoples had a sense of self. They knew that they were part of a community. They knew they were part of a family. They knew that they had obligations and responsibilities. Everybody had a job to do.
The relations actually were really interesting between the early settler, because there was a lot of cooperation. The Indigenous people helped the settlers survive.
They would often arrive here with scurvy, with diseases from lack of good quality food, no vitamin C. And they came very unhealthy, and they lost a lot of people on those journeys. The Indigenous people literally took pity on them. And their way was always to help strangers. because you never know when you are out hunting or when you are traveling who you're going to come across or who will need help. So it was very much about one of giving, and you give and you receive in a very equal way.
The Indigenous people adopted the settlers into their family group, so they were just very welcoming.
Treaties, as seen by the Indigenous people, were seen as honorable ways of conduct. The original treaties between Indigenous peoples were oral documents, as in it wasn't written down, it was remembered. And it was shared within the community so everybody had an understanding of what had been agreed upon. Whereas when we think of treaties, we think of the written documents from the colonialism.
Early settlers, if it wasn't written down, it wasn't true. Okay, so the early settlers wrote it down, and that's where the conflict lies. Conflict lies in that what was said orally versus what was written down doesn't balance out.
So many of the things that were agreed to in the treaties were not communicated to the signing parties, who were the Indigenous peoples. And some of it was done by lack of communication, lack of ability to speak in those languages, and some was done with pure intent to pull the wool over their eyes.
The European colonies felt the need to make treaties with the Indigenous people because there were concerns about wars with the British felt like the French were going to fight them.
And so they were considered treaties more or less based on skirmishes and civil issues between the colonialist peoples themselves. And indeed, the number of treaties, many of them were done because the Indigenous people had already been starved into submission. The buffalo had been decimated. And the treaties forced them onto these little parcels of land.
If we look at the way those treaties were negotiated then, and we look at today's standards, they would fall short of fairness. Because for contracts in today's world, there has to be a meeting of minds. And when those treaties were being entered into, were being signed, the Indigenous people had a different concept of land ownership than what the colonialists had.
Treaties with the colonial people were not advantageous for the Indigenous people. They were land grabs, not land surrenders. The Indigenous people were sought to be controlled as the Indian problem. And the way to do that was to put in legislation with this new Canadian government so that they would have that element of control.
The Indian Act is a document that controlled Indigenous people's way of life. It controlled their government, controlled their rituals, their ceremonies, controlled everything that had to do with Indigenous peoples. And it was presented and followed through without Indigenous people's consent.
The Indian Act is considered to be one of the most racist pieces of legislation that has ever existed. Because looking at the Indian Act, the purpose of it was basically to ensure that the Indigenous people lived differently from the European people, because the European settlers had thought that the Indigenous people were not like them.
There was very much a hierarchy, and the Indigenous people were considered savage, uneducated, wild, difficult to train, spoke all these different languages. They couldn't even speak all the same languages. So they were definitely looked down upon by the non-Indigenous people and the powers that be.
And what the Indian Act did was not in line with human rights laws, what human rights seeks to establish. Some of the most egregious human rights violations made by the government of Canada and the church would be actually the creation of the residential schools, the enactment of the Indian Act, which brought that about.
children were taken away and stripped of who they were. And there was the saying, and it was written within legislation, kill the Indian in the child. That was their goal. They were, however, killing the children as well.
They made the Indigenous people learn English, learn how to write, and if they didn't, and they used their own language, they were beaten, right? And tremendous other kind of violence was used against the Indigenous children to get them to speak English, get them to learn to read and write, and be obedient.
And in those residential schools, survivors have recounted malnutrition, living in very poor quarters, overcrowded quarters. A lot of children died. And as we know in Canada today, some of them have not been found.
When you take children away from their people, their lands, their culture, their language, that is a definition of genocide in the UN Declaration.
And the Indian Act is still in existence, so let's not forget that. Even though there have been some amendments to the Indian Act, so some rights have been restored, but it is still there, and it's still branded the Indian Act.
Indigenous people continue to experience systemic discrimination, prejudice, each and every day. So in the eyes of the justice system, there's inequity. In the eyes of the policing system, there's inequity. In the eyes of the education system, there's inequity. In the eyes of medical and healthcare, there's inequity.
I think systemic racism reinforces the trauma.
Intergenerational trauma is trauma that is handed down from generation to generation. And we know now that it's called epigenic, in that it's carried in the cell.
Trauma has been developed over the many years that violence and abuse was occurring for Indigenous people. And trauma is really hard to get rid of, trauma and really hard to heal.
And it manifests itself in many ways, in susceptibility to addiction, to disease, to violent behavior, to mental illness.
Some people still deny the experience that Indigenous people went through. You cannot deny a person's lived experience. Some Indigenous communities still don't have access to clean, potable water. I mean, this is the 21st century.
I think that, the truth and reconciliation is a healing method, but it involves truth, okay? It involves truth. And a lot of people don't want to hear the truth.
The truth in the Truth and Reconciliation is acknowledging that these violations happened and teaching future generations that this is what was done to the Indigenous people.
I think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission took a hard look at what the survivors had to say and their stories. And for many, it was the first time they were believed.
Now, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up with 94 calls for action.
It needed to be a call to action to make and effect change. And with that comes a sense of responsibility. And that's what the focus is for those 94 calls to action. It's calling the Canadian government and the Canadian people to act on these 94 calls.
I looked at the stats on Beyond Calls to Action, and there are 49 calls to action that haven't started. And there are 35 calls to action that are in progress or have been completed. Let's get working on it. Let's get some things happening, and let's get them completed.
And as Canadians, it's our responsibility to learn the truth, face it head on, and to make intentions to move forward.
I think Canadians can continue to learn about the history of Indigenous people and finding out what they can do in being a part of that.
You can attend Indigenous activities, Powwows are open to everybody. You can go to powwows. Take an around dance. They're fun. You never see anybody in a circle who doesn't have a smile on their face when they're dancing a round dance. Learn when you have opportunities to be exposed to Indigenous culture. I think Canada and its citizens and its future citizens can heal, can be on this journey of learning and facing truth. We need courage. We need strength. We have the strength. We have the courage. We need only call upon it to be able to make those changes in a good way.
Great work. Thank you so much. Cheryle, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Neil, for that wonderful piece of art, piece of work, piece of truth. I'm grateful because you did it in such a good and thorough way and a kind way. And thank you, Temi, for your input to this. I see Barb's not here, but I'll pass along those wonderful sharings as well, because we all spoke truth in a way, and we were looking at it from different angles. Temi was looking at it from a legal aspect. Barb was looking at it from an academic aspect. And I was providing it from working on the Truth and Reconciliation Building Capacity workshop. I have done the one-day workshop over 6 times. And I'm actually in the process of, I've had to split it into 2 days for the YWCA. So I've done it for many groups. And I would like very much to share this with the university population, both with faculties, but also with staff and admin and with researchers, so that they can get a fuller depth and breadth of understanding. The workshop that we did work on with Teresa Miles, graduate student from Workland, and Rowan Hickey, the articling student, took a lot of work. And I'm grateful to Teresa because we were basically able to use her dissertation of looking at the 94 calls to action as a basis for this workshop, and then flesh it out and get more information. So I'm so grateful to have developed this one-day workshop. And the workshop itself, the purpose is to fight Indigenous racism and prejudice and provide understanding to all citizens, both in Canada and outside of Canada. The workshop that we developed is an all-day workshop. It opens with traditional acknowledgement of territory and prayer and an offering of tobacco in a good Indigenous protocol way, and recognition and respect for Indigenous ways of knowing. And then we look at the medicine wheel teachings, PowerPoint that I've developed, and provides insight into why we use the medicine wheel teachings as a basis of looking at those 94 calls to action, which can be quite overwhelming just to look at it in a lump sum. Teresa was able very much by putting it into 4 quadrants representing the medicine wheel and looking at those 4 quadrants and the 4 methods that she used and that we were able to work on and fill in. Was the first part, the difficult part, was the legal aspect. How did we get into this? Pre-contact and post-contact. The effect of colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy on the Indigenous peoples, which exuded racism and prejudice and violated the human rights of the Indigenous people in Canada. The workshop goes on to look at the medical aspect of it as well, as Indigenous people may have some coverage from the NIHB or NHIB, the Indigenous Health Board, but they're not everything is covered. And there's also a lot of incorrect assumptions as to what Indigenous people are entitled to as members of signing treaties. And those who are on ceded territory have basic rights. And trying to provide this understanding and insight into the legal aspect of how we got here. That is the first quadrant that we look at. And that's probably the heaviest. When I do the workshop, I will do the medicine wheel and the first quadrant in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we look at the other 3 quadrants. And the workshop looks at the medical aspect, the educational aspect, including the effects of residential school and how Indigenous people are still underrepresented in the education system throughout Canada. And comparatively, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, when compared to their succession rates, Indigenous people are very much below what would be expected of education, both in the K-12 system, but also in post-secondary systems, also in advanced education, in colleges and educational institutions throughout Canada. So we take a look at that. We also look at medical issues and the innate racism and systemic racism that causes Indigenous people to be under-serviced by the healthcare in our country, to be outright seen as less than. And just to share a little bit of insight, a friend of mine had been at the university hospital, which is the Foothills, and had overheard a senior nurse talking to a new nurse on strength, and she couldn't believe this nurse had said, well, and if they self-identify as Indigenous, don't give them pain medication unless they have a prescription from the doctor. That's racism, latent racism. And that's just one peek at how it is within the medical system. There's also the legal and justice system. When we look at justice issues, Indigenous people are far overly represented as suffering under the justice system. They're overrepresented in jails. They're overrepresented in how they are carded, as it said. They're picked up by policing systems and abused in those police systems. And the numbers are too high when compared to, we're less than 10% of the population. In some cases, 2% of the population. Yet, in many of the jails, 50% of the population is Indigenous. In some of the jails, it's up to 90% that are recognized as Indigenous people. Why? How did they get there? How are they not represented fairly in the courts? How are they accosted by the police forces that are out there? So we look at that as well. And we also look at the children, the education system, but also the welfare system. There was the residential school system, and then after that, the 60s scoop, where Indigenous children were taken away from their parents, from their reserves, from their culture, their language, and in many cases sent out of country, sent overseas, sent to the States, and were never connected to who they were as Indigenous peoples, and are only now, in many cases, finding their way back. Indeed, Métis people were suffering the same as well. It was a shameful thing to be identified as Métis, and many hid the fact that they were Métis and hid those Indigenous connections to their roots as Indigenous people. And only now many of them are coming back to find their roots and who they are as Métis people, who we are as Indigenous people, who we are to be proud of the blood that runs in our veins. And indeed, we have more children of Indigenous heritage within today's social services and care issues than there are Indigenous people in the country. We're overrepresented. Here in Alberta, 60 to 70% of Indigenous children in care are Indigenous. Of people, children in care, 70% are Indigenous. Why? Issues of poverty, issues of addiction, issues of racism, and the lack of understanding of extended family. Many Indigenous children were often raised by their grandparents, and yet that is seen as less than. We have this idea of the nuclear family. You got to have mom and dad and the kids. Well, there's too many single parents who are being forced to raise their children, many times in poverty, many times without adequate education to be able to get the jobs they need. So this workshop looks at this 94 calls to action and places them in a position of understanding of why this was developed through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in conjunction with speaking with the survivors, but also with Indigenous leadership, banded council, looking at history, looking at statistics and data. So for me, it's very much about sharing the truth, and in many cases, very difficult truth, and being brave enough to accept that, but not about leading people, especially non-Indigenous people, in positions of guilt and blame, but rather giving them the tools. Well, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to move forward in a good way? So this workshop for me provides tools for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to learn their truths, learn the truth of Canada, learn our responsibilities as citizens, to honor people's human rights, to live, work, raise their families, be educated, to be safe, to have enough in this country. At the end of the workshop, I always end my workshops with a sharing circle, because these difficult truths need to be shared, and it gives people the permission to ask hard questions and to share where they're coming from and to acknowledge their guilt, but also to let it go and instead focus on, well, what actions can I take? How can I make things better? How can I move forward? How can I learn and continue to learn through artists, writers, through video and movies, through education that's now opening up and providing truth within the schools, and bringing in Indigenous teachers, Indigenous traditional knowledge keepers, Indigenous elders to share our languages, to share our truths and our stories. People learn best from stories. And we find when we're in this workshop, we have far more in common than we do that separates us. We have far more in common. Let's focus on those commonalities. Let's work together to fight and recognize and acknowledge difficult truths. Take a hard look at prejudice and discrimination, especially systemic discrimination, especially the fact that Indigenous peoples here in Canada, the most water-rich nation in the world, and yet Indigenous people on reserves, some of them don't have access to potable water, and they're surrounded by lakes. Why is that? And it has a lot to do with the motivation of the governments, the federal government, provincial, municipal. We need to have our voices raised, as I do quite often, and ask why, and what can we do better, and how can we move forward together to affect change in a good way. So for me, it's very much about taking responsibility and taking action and not being afraid to move forward and to let go of those preconceptions, those assumptions that are wrong. Indigenous people don't get free education. I know. It took me 11 years to pay off my student loans. I know. And I'm a status card carrying Indigenous person, but it's not equal all across Canada. We have a lot of inequity, but that can be fixed one day at a time, one person at a time, one heart at a time. I'm a firm believer that we need to change hearts before we can change minds. And this video shows that. And the workshop provides that information and enables participants to look at that, to work with the truth, and to engage them to moving forward in positive action. And I'm very grateful to Neil for putting together this wonderful video. And I really like the other one you did on the medicine wheel teachings as well. So that's another one. That's a juicy one too. And it is that we have far more in common. And the teachings of the medicine wheel aren't just for Indigenous people, but for all people, to help us have balance and moderation in our own lives and have that balance between our head and our body and our heart and our spirit. And something to be worked towards each and every day as individuals, as family members, as members of communities, as members of our province and our nation and our country in a good way. We are all citizens of Earth, and colonization has wreaked damage across the globe. And we're looking at the Canadian experience, but know that many of these truths carry over and across to other countries and other Indigenous peoples as well. And that suffering is still going on today, and we see that in many ways, shapes, and forms. Thank you. Thank you. And are there any questions, comments? I'll leave the mic open and let Sharnjeet and Myrna take hold of this.
Hi, it's me, Linda. So just to be clear to the audience, and there's actually a series of 3 videos that are available. And one is the one you saw, but there's also one on the medicine wheel. And then there's another one on the seminar or the group activity. And those will be freely available on our website. And so we just want to make sure that, you know, and also I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the majority of funding for this video was provided by the government of Alberta. So we're thankful that they supported our work in making this video, and we need to acknowledge that not every little thing that they do is annoying, because this was, I think, a very wonderful project that they supported. So and thank you everyone for all your hard work on it. I really, it's a wonderful encapsulating of the key points, you know. So.
Any questions or comments?
Can I just come off mute and ask a question? So the workshop that you were talking about, where can we find information about it? I'm not an employee or student of University of Calgary, but rather Alberta Health Services. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a great question. For me, it's just been more or less word of mouth and through Alberta Civil Liberties. I would advise to contact Alberta Civil Liberties, who can reach out to me to be able to provide that. I'd love very much to be able to share this workshop with any interested parties. And just to let you know, I've shared it with church groups, United Church groups. I've shared it with different organizations and agencies such as the Calgary Renaissance Singers. I've been to Notre Dame High School for their Indigenous class and did a shortened version for their grade 12s. So we've got a bit of flexibility when it comes to showing this, but I really like the day-long workshop because it is so full and it provides that sharing circle at the end so people can debrief afterwards, because this is a lot of very heavy information. And I really believe that we need to be on a healing journey, and it's good to have all participants feel part of this and to help them on their own healing journeys and understanding journeys in this way. So definitely you can get a hold of me to be able to present that workshop. And it is something that is within the purview of Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. Thank you for asking.
So yes, everything will be posted on our website, and I put a link to our website in the chat box for those who are interested. So Cheryle, today there was an article about the Indigenous people and housing. I don't know if you were able to see the article. So since you were mentioning everything, so housing is included as well. So the Indigenous people still don't have proper housing, which is a human rights, right? So if we count different fields where we can see inequality.
Very much so. And just to give you a little bit of hope, I was part of an eco workshop hosted by CISA from campus. And they had a speaker in, Richard Sparvier, who I just happen to know. And he was talking about how at Siksika, they are doing these 3D built houses that can be put up within 2 days, even outside, because they just put tents up. And they 3D these houses. It's like instant housing, and they're fireproof and mildew proof. And they're smaller houses. They'd like to be able to expand them. Right now, they're only 1-bedroom houses, but they're great for elders because Siksika suffered during the floods, and much of the housing was inundated with flood water and not habitable because of the mold and the mildew. And there's still homelessness both on and off reserve, but on the reserve as well. So seeing these houses that could be built within a very short time frame to be able to house people right on the reserve, built by people on the reserve, paid for by the reserve, fills me with hope. And I'd love to see these houses going up all across Canada. So I was very much inspired by these 3D houses that they were able to put up, because they fulfill a need and they're long lasting. When the government of Canada would put up houses on reserves, they had a very short shelf life. Even the water stations for watering, short shelf life, 20 years. Well, some of these places have been up for 40 years, 50 years, and the people still need housing, and they're inadequate, the houses that the government had put up. So I see better placement of government monies where we can see positive change by working with the Indigenous people to affect that change, to find out what their needs are and how that can be put in process. So I just wanted to share that little ray of hope, because for me, that was very much a ray of hope. Thank you.
Yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed. So any idea when the second video is going to be released? No, not yet. Linda?
All three of the videos are finished. We just have to post them up to our our website. We're in a bit of a transitional moment at the center because we're building a brand new website. And so there's a little bit of hiccups around if it's going to go on the current one or the new one and that, but we have Facebook and we'll announce everything as soon as it's available. So I'm sorry that there's a bit of confusion. I'm confused myself, and because we just had a meeting with the fellow that's doing our website and it's coming along. It's just, if you look at our current website, you'll see that it's very dense, has a lot of information, and it takes a long time to move that all to a different site. So we just have to be patient. I hope that helps. You know, with people, but don't get lost in the shuffle, right, of what we're doing.
Thanks, Linda. There's a note from Julia here, which says, thank you. I will involve AHS Provincial DAI group to promote the workshop and reach an agreement with you. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you,
awesome.
Julia.
I think we definitely need to work with the Alberta Health Services, so that's wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much. We do need to work with you. And we are
Everybody
still
needs to know this stuff, right? It's I teach at the university, and I have done so for a long time, and I've got many different degrees and so on, but I absolutely never learned about residential schools ever until I had to teach it. So we've got a lot of work to do to educate our right from day one up, so people understand the truth of the situation, like you said.
Oh, absolutely. And it just recently that I've learned that actually the houses on the reserves are not owned by the people who live in these houses, but they are actually built by the government. And sometimes people are not even allowed to do any renovations or house improvements. And it's actually completely shocking because, yeah, I mean, a lot of us really do not know anything, yeah, about the realities of everyday life. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly is something that hasn't been talked about very much, and it's been so that's another reason that I'm happy that the Alberta government gave us the money and didn't tell us what we could and could not do with it, because then we can get it out there, this information, to where it needs to be, right? So.
And thank you very much for doing that. Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Can I just say something about the creation of the video?
Sure, Neil.
Yeah. At first, when Linda approached me to make this video, and in further discussions with Cheryle, I found what appeared to me to be an incredibly daunting task, and that's summarizing 300 years of history to 12 minutes. The creation of this video had me in tears many, many times, and it helped me understand a lot about the heart and soul and the resilience of Canada's Indigenous people. But in only making a video 12 minutes long, it goes really fast. There's a lot of information in there. And Julie, I saw your message about wanting to see it a couple times, and I encourage everybody to do that. I also encourage everybody to have conversations about this at home and share this video with your family members. I think if we really want to create positive change, we need to do it, one person at a time, one connection at a time. And this video is not the be all and end all. It'll help you get a really basic understanding, but there is so much history, there are so many stories, and there's so much untold in that video that I encourage you all to reach out to other resources like the the website for the Center of Truth and Reconciliation, to look at Government Canada websites. Part of a lot of the work that I did was sifting through Library and Archives, Canada's Library and Archives, which had a lot of imagery and a lot of documents that were very interesting. Create your own personal journey in terms of understanding this and share it with everybody. The video is just a start.
Thank you, Neil.
Can I just make a comment? I have to run to another meeting, but I just would like to say thank you very much for this experience. Thank you, Cheryle. Thank you, Myrna, Linda, Tammy, Neil, for creating a movie like that. I can't even imagine how much work must have gone into doing something like that, and the imagery is so beautiful. So thank you for taking time and making it happen, and looking forward to see that movie online and sharing it with the network and seeing how we can help to spread the word and make sure that people know that that workshop exists and that movies like that also exist, so we all can learn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena. Well, thank you, everyone. I know we have some people who have to start a workshop at 1 o'clock. So shall we end it here? Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Cheryle, again. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, everybody.
We
Thank
look
you.
forward to seeing the next video.